right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for LaPorte Cafe this morning. We're ready and we're back and we're ready to discuss some trending topics that we see affecting the public sector right now. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are muted and the video is off and the chat function is disabled, but our presentation will be conversational with no prepared slides. And if you do have a question, you can submit it via the Zoom Q&A portal. My name is Lester Richoux. I'm a director here at LaPorte in Audit and Assurance Services. And today with me is Lindy Stonecypher, a director in our current accounting services department. And today we're going to talk about the Local Government Budget Act. I know it's very relevant for some folks. School boards, today's your day to make sure you have everything lined up before you go forward. And then we'll just go over some basics and look at some best practices that we have observed. So I guess the first question, Lindy, take us through what is the Local Government Budget Act and who does it apply to? And let's just get started with the basics.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. The legislative auditor, of course, requires governmental entities to have a budget. And they do this because governmental agencies aren't allowed to expend money without authority. So your governing authority, whoever that may be, a council, a board, has to approve your budget. So that's kind of why they set this law up originally. But more than that, a budget it should be utilized, even though it's a requirement, it should be used. It should help you summarize your revenues and your expenditures, help you know what you're spending. It should be looked at on a regular basis to see if you're in line.
Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of times folks think about the budgets as just something they have to do to be in compliance with the law. And I try to just keep people aware, you know, budget's a tool. It's another tool in the accounting and the finance department's bag of tricks to make sure you're monitoring things. It's a way to control some things and review and approve expenditures just to make sure you're on track, you know, and things should pop out when you do that budget to actual comparison.
Right.
Maybe something unexpected will show up, but let's go over some of the elements of who should be adopting budgets. You know, just some of the basics there.
Sure. Like I said, every governmental agency, that is municipalities and parishes, elected officials such as sheriffs, assessors, who have their own, they don't really have a governing authority. The elected official section, which is the sheriffs and the assessors. School boards, I don't know if I've mentioned school boards, court systems, special districts, our fire departments, water districts, recreation districts. Everybody is required to have a budget according to this budget law.
And then an important element there is charter schools too. So if
Yes.
charter schools do, even though some of those are not-for-profit entities, there is a caveat that says a charter school should be adopting a budget as well. So so we said adopting. So let's sort of outline some of the process here to go and get that prepared. I know it's for some folks it's kind of a long and arduous process, and at times it does seem long and arduous, but there are some specific elements that have to be accomplished here because, like I mentioned before, there's a compliance element here, and as an auditor, it's one of the things that we look at to make sure the entities that we audit are in compliance with this Local Budget Act. So let's just start at the beginning with how this process unfolds, Lindy.
Sure. Typically, you're going to have the accounting department and the director or president, whatever their title may be, the mayor, the parish president. Parishes typically probably have a whole a group of people who work on it, and it has to be the legislative auditor does have a template out there on their website that you could use. It's an Excel template that you can use. There are some main requirements that are included in a budget, but you want to start by going to your department heads and have them submit what they want. And maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't, right? But you should go to your main people in your organization, whoever that may be, if they're not department heads, whoever the main the key people in your organization. And you want to look at revenue streams, expenditures. You have to look at salaries. Typically, salaries are a big, a troubling area, right? Do we give a raise? Can we give a raise? Do we have enough new revenue stream to be able to do that? Hopefully, you're doing your budget after if you have ad valorem revenues in as part of your revenue stream, then you've actually looked at the ad valorem that's been approved. That's typically done in July, June and July, and it gets sent out to the tax commission. So you should have an idea of what your ad valorem revenue stream is going to be. Sales tax, of course, is a big unknown, especially with the pandemic. We are unsure of what was going to happen with that. So you may even at this point have to go back a couple of years to get a look at your activity. I have in the past had prepared an Excel schedule of say 3 or 4 years worth of activity, just an income statement that provides us with 3 or 4 years worth of activity, and get a history and actually do a budget based on what you think you're going to incur. The required information, if you didn't know if you wanted me to go over that, but they are.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times, people first question is how much detail do we put on these budgets? Obviously we mentioned earlier that it should be a tool that you can use. So I think the detail, and maybe you can expand on that. How deep should we go into the actual expenditures of an organization?
Right. Technically, the law says that you're required to include the beginning and ending fund balances, your revenues and expenditures. It should be itemized by source, other financing sources, by source and use. You should also have a side-by-side comparison from your year-to-date actual amounts and the estimates that are remaining for the remainder of the year. So if, let's say, your calendar year government and you're looking at your activity through September 30th, then you want to have a 9/30 actual number for your income and expenses, and then have an estimate of where you anticipate the year to fall out. So you're going to estimate the remaining 3 months of the year. And you use that. And again, their Excel it's a little hard to follow, but basically if you take it and adapt it to your organization, then it really does help you. It's got all the formulas in there for you. And so it's not that hard to use their budget, but the requirements are, revenue, expenditures by source. And then you have to show your beginning and ending estimated fund balances, because of course you have to have a balanced budget, meaning that you can't spend more than you collect. Now, you may have a negative for the current year in net income. You are allowed to have a net loss if you have fund balance to cover that. And so that's why they require that fund balance to be reported on their schedules to verify that if you do have a loss, because you may have received money in the prior year that you don't get to expend until the current year. So you may end up having an expenditure greater than the revenue.
And I think that's an important point, because some of the things we encounter when we talk to folks in finance departments is that's a hard concept to explain maybe to some of the decision makers, that it's maybe they may have some kind of enabling legislation that requires them to balance their budget, but you are able to spend or budget for expenditures in excess of revenues as long as you have available means to cover that, the fund balance. And that's, just from encounters with various folks and speaking to them, that's a concept that's not always understood by some of the decision makers at organizations. So it's a good point, and it's often hard to communicate. But
yes,
according to
balance is a difficult concept.
According to the Budget Act, you are okay and in compliance if you do that, right? So, and then as far as the detail, I think that's a big point. A lot of folks struggle with how much to put in there, how deep you go, and like I said earlier, I think it's important to just understand what you want to look at, what you want to monitor over time, Obviously, you just don't want to have a couple lines on your budget that say general government and a couple of other elements of your organization and leave it at that. You probably want a little bit more detail about salaries and benefits and the various programs that you might have in place and things you're going to spend the money on. But obviously, you don't want to get too far into the details and budget out every copying machine and things like that, every contract you might have in place. So it's a fine line you have to walk. I understand just talking to folks around, they get a little pushback on how much information they need to provide, but obviously everyone, it's a busy time of year when you're preparing these budgets. So it's an efficiency and a time saving as well. And just sometimes just cutting it off and not going too deep into the woods. So
Right. Sometimes it's easier, if you take your profit and loss statement and look at each one of the line items, you may also be able to summarize some categories, right? So total salaries and benefits together, or total occupancy costs if you're renting a facility, or so there may be some ways to summarize that information to make it a little easier. But it's always best to start off with start with the detail and then summarize it from there. But again, what's required is a minimum amount.
So let's go over some of the elements of the compliance part. I know there's a publishing requirement and then the various public hearings and things that go from there. So let's kind of just outline those, Lindy, and start at the beginning. Once you have the budget ready and
yeah, it has to be advertised, of course, in the public journal. But what is required to be advertised in the public journal is the open meeting. And so budgets have to be adopted in an open meeting. So you have to advertise 10 days prior to your public hearing. You have to present the budget in your public hearing, and then it's adopted in an open meeting, is the way that works. And you have to have that meeting 15 at a minimum, at the latest, 15 days prior to your fiscal year end. So you want to make sure you have enough time to get the 10 days in the journal. A lot of times that journal requires you to submit that information 1 month ahead of time or 2 weeks ahead of time. So you really have to have that planned out, but it does have to be advertised if you have a budget that's greater than $500,000. The budget itself is not required to be advertised in the paper. A lot of our governmental agencies do that, especially our larger ones, because the budget is required to be available for public inspection prior to your meeting. So a lot of people do that through the paper. And so you'll see when it's coming close to budget time, either right before 6:30 or right before December 31st, you're going to see a lot of our local parishes, school boards, they may be submitting their entire budget in the paper. That way it sort of protects them, but it's not a requirement. A lot of people don't understand that you don't have to advertise the budget in the paper. But again, if you're greater than 500,000, you have to advertise. If you're less than 500,000, you don't have to advertise. That's the only difference between if you're greater or less than 500,000. Everybody's still required to have a budget for the general fund and the special revenue funds. I don't think we touched on that earlier, Lester. They're the funds that are required to have a budget. If you have enterprise funds, it's a good idea to have those the expenditures have to be approved and so by the governing authority. So it's a good idea to have a budget for those, even though they're not part of the required budgets from the budget law. So I would definitely have a budget for your enterprise funds as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lindy. One of the things we did skip over, and I'm glad you brought it up, but it kind of goes back to that the budget is a tool. And so we always advise clients, and we see folks just create a budget for all of your funds, just so it gives you something to monitor and review and make sure things are on track. And another element you brought up, when we're talking about the timing, I know this process it can be long sometimes, but it just goes to show you how you have to put a little planning ahead of time, because when you talk about the dates and when you have to advertise and you have to make sure you get it to the journal to your journal ahead of time. You know, they might have a publication date of X, but you have to get something submitted a week or two beforehand, just so they can get it in the paper and in process and get it published. So it's a good idea. This is where the auditor in me says it's a good idea to have a little bit of controls over the budgeting process to make sure someone in your organization is aware of the timing of this, you know, so it's not just a set, we have to do X 10 days before and this. No, it's really a little bit before, because you have to get it to the paper and they have to make sure that it's going to go out in time. And I've seen a lot of organizations get tripped up with that. You know, they'll think they can meet, you know, it's 10, they're just thinking straight 10 days before, or, you know, the timing, and they're not thinking about, well, we have to get it to the paper. The paper's got some turnaround time, and then you have to get it out. And so it kind of delays their process for when they can have these meetings, and then so forth from there. And the next thing you know, they're not in compliance with the actual local budget act, and then, you know, we've got an ultimate issue there because they're not complied. Right. So it really is something to be aware of and have on your calendar to when you have to start the process. And
I think that's why it's good to go with 9 months after your fiscal year end, to look at that activity for 9 months. And that leaves you, if you're doing that, say for a calendar year end, you're doing that at the beginning of October, hopefully. And then that should give you plenty of time to get everything done. If you have workshops, a lot of our larger governmentals, such as the parish and the cities, may have workshops, budget workshops, where they invite the public.
Yes, definitely. And just something to think about going forward. And as you're adopting your budgets, making sure you have these timelines correct. We should probably talk about amendments to budgets. What happens once you've got all this in place and you've adopted your budget? And I think we should mention, you know, after you adopt your budget, you have to publish that you've certified the budget as well. But now you're into your calendar year, and what happens now? You're monitoring your budget, and obviously the law's got some elements in it that say once you identify some variances, I think we're all familiar with the 5%. We call it the 5% rule. What happens, Lindy? What do we do at that point? Now we've got to amend it.
Yep. Now we have to amend it, and the budget law actually says, as you mentioned, Lester, you're required to amend your budget when there's a change in operations, but they don't really define that for us. And so sometimes, you know, you may monitor that on a monthly basis. You may monitor that on a quarterly basis. You may only look at it once a year right before your fiscal year end. And so you do not have to advertise an amendment unless the elected officials do actually have to advertise in the paper, because they don't have a governing authority. So like the assessor or the sheriff, and I use those as the two examples because they're the biggest elected officials that we have. So not municipalities, not parishes, not school boards. They all have a council or board of some sort, the recreation districts, et cetera, that you're not required to advertise your amendment. So that really makes that amendment process much simpler than the original process of having to, if you're required to advertise your budget. In the amendment, basically, you're going to want to look at, typically you don't resubmit the entire budget. You may want to show the changes, right? So you may only show, you know, if sales tax, something happened and sales tax is down greater than the 5%. You may want to just show the pieces of your budget that are changing, that you're amending. So you're not required to recreate the entire budget. A lot of people do. You are also allowed to have more stringent rules than what the legislative auditor requires, which is just a change in operations. And so, but at a minimum, they do require the 5% rule, which is, again, if you fall into that and you don't amend your budget, then like Lester had said, the auditors, they have a problem with that as well. And you're not in compliance with the budget law. So you can be not in compliance a couple of different ways with your budget. So you really do have to be careful and be aware and look at that.
Right. And I think it back goes back to just making sure you're monitoring your budget, because obviously we mentioned this is a tool. So there's the 5% rule where you're monitoring to identify these variances, and then going through the process and making sure you're getting these on the agendas at your meetings. You're publishing those, agendas are published, so you've got the amendment coming up, and then going forward and amending the budget. And when it's all said and done, I think hopefully, you reach the end of your calendar, your fiscal year, and it comes time to perform your audit. I like to just put a plug in, make sure you're monitoring that, because it's one of those easy compliance findings that you can avoid if you're just going through the process. And there's some high water marks in the year. If you think about it, you adopt your budget. Like you said, if you do this process in September, you're going to roll around to the next September and adopt your next year's budget. It gives you the opportunity to look at your current year budget that you're in, right? And identify those variances and go ahead and try to clean that up ahead of time. It's something you can fix. It's a simple thing to amend that budget and make sure you just line everything up, because like I said, it's something we're required to look at as auditors, but I do think it's an easy fix, and it's just following through on the process. So I'm just looking to see if we have any questions, and I just want to make sure I covered a couple of talking points as we go through. When we talk about timing and public inspection, I always know it's budget time. When I go to an organization and I see their budget published on the front door of the organization, right? So just want to make sure we talk about that. Lindy, that's an acceptable means to publish your budget, right? The door, the window, the glass, right outside your building. That's all on the up and up.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be available for inspection, and that again is not really for public inspection. That again is not defined in the law specifically how you can do that. That's why, some of the smaller special districts, it's easier for them. They may have one building, one main office that people come in and out of to get to their administrative complex. And so that's easier. Whereas if you are a city or a town, a city, you may have multiple doors that people can go in and out of. It may be a little more complicated than just posting it. Or if you're like some entities, they do a completely detailed, full profit and loss, every account on their trial balance by department. And so their budget could be extremely long. And so putting it on their door may not be, the best option. And so that's why we see at that time actually putting it on the web, posting it in the public journal. So. Okay.
Well, we've reached about the end of our time here, and we appreciate you joining us today. We know I mentioned earlier it's the 15th, so that's a big day for school board. You have to have had your public hearing by today, so hopefully our attendees here from our school board representatives have covered that. But we do appreciate everyone joining us this morning, and we hope you gained a little knowledge. And if you have any additional follow-up questions, please contact Lindy or myself here at LaPorte, and we'd be happy to speak with you about the budget process.
Thank y'all for attending today. Really appreciate it.
Have a great day.